My name is Deb Templeton, and I'm the chairman of the Bellwether League Foundation. Welcome to the Foundation's 2021 Healthcare Supply Chain Leadership Forum, our first ever virtual educational forum. The forum will focus on a variety of topics related to healthcare supply chain leadership. Our first panel will focus on how supply chain can build upon the momentum and increased awareness as a result of the pandemic that the supply chain is indeed a strategic asset that deserves a voice in the C-suite. Next, Foundation co-founder Jamie Kowalski will cover the results of the most recent survey on supply chain leadership, including succession planning, leadership traits, and critical questions surrounding the training needs of the next generation of supply chain leaders. The final panel will explore how supply chain and clinicians can work more closely with finance executives, moving beyond the focus of unit price paid to improved financials driven by reliable, high-quality patient care. 2020 was certainly a year of change, and the Bellwether League Foundation was no exception. The name has changed to the Bellwether League Foundation, including now the word foundation. It's now a 501c3 organization, which allows donations to the foundation to be tax exempt. The structure has changed to include a smaller board, consisting of me as the chairman, Jamie Kowalski as a co-founding member and secretary, and Rick Dana Barlow as a co-founding member, executive director, and treasurer. The board is supported by an advisory committee that includes Karen Conway, Dee Donatelli, Nick Gaish, Kate Polchinski, and Vance Moore. There are task forces that support the foundation, including the nominating task force, which is now selecting future Famer and Bellwether inductees for 2021, the most mission-critical function of the foundation. The sponsorship task force, led by Vance Moore, working on sustainability for the organization via donations and sponsorships, and the education and media task force, led by Karen Conway, producing programs that you're about to experience. An exciting addition to the foundation is the philanthropy arm, headed by Nick Gaish. There will be exciting news from this additional focus for the foundation, including grants and scholarships and academic partnerships in the near future. In addition, the website has been updated to include easier navigation, access to the nomination forms, and the ability to donate via credit card. You can now submit names for both future Famers and Bellwethers on an ongoing basis, so please do so. I'm sure you all know someone worthy of the distinction that has been impactful to you and your career or to the supply chain in general. Now, please enjoy the program. You're encouraged to engage with the speakers by using the chat and Q&A buttons located at the bottom of your screen. You can submit questions for the panelists using the Q&A function on the left side of your screen. We will try to answer these at the end of the webcast, but if we run out of time, we will reconnect with you through email. If you have any technical difficulties during the broadcast, please check out the help feature at the bottom of the screen. If you cannot find the answer to the problem you are experiencing, you can also submit technical questions via the Q&A. You are encouraged to be part of the conversation by providing commentary via the chat feature. It is now with much thanks and appreciation for leading the production of this forum that I would like to introduce Karen Conway, Vice President, Healthcare Value at GHX, and to also thank GHX, a platinum sustaining sponsor of the foundation, and all of our speakers and contributors to today's program. Please enjoy the first panel discussion on putting supply chain in its place.
Thank you, Deb. And thank you to everyone who's joining us today for what I believe is a very important conversation about how we secure supply chain's role at the strategic table, and how do we build upon that position. As Deb said, a lot of us have a lot of supply chain professionals have suddenly been at the strategic table, but during an emergency. And the question is, how do we maintain that strategic role and importance of supply chain and impact of supply chain beyond just emergency preparedness? So I'd like to introduce our panelists. They probably need no introduction, but just in case you haven't had the pleasure of meeting them, I'll go in alphabetical order. Dr. Randy Bradley is an associate professor of supply chain and information systems management at the University of Tennessee. He also serves as executive vice president of digital transformation for the Biosupply Management Alliance. Many of you already know him as one of the most insightful thinkers and energetic speakers on a variety of topics, including digital transformation, supply chain digitization, and the strategic application of business analytics to information technology and to the supply chain. Teresa Dale is the Chief Supply Chain Officer at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, where she's responsible for over $1 billion in spend for the academic medical center. But Teresa is also the president of 3 separate for-profit companies that are affiliated with the medical center, and all of them really exhibit Teresa's personal passion for doing things that matter for the patients. So the first company is the Vanderbilt Health Purchasing Collaborative. It works with a number of other provider organizations to help aggregate contract volume, and more importantly, to use clinical evidence to standardize that contract portfolio. She's also president of Vanderbilt Health Supply Chain Solutions, also working with a number of other providers, helping them streamline processes, improve efficiencies, increase customer satisfaction, and reduce operating expenditures. And finally, CareFluent Connect. This is a company that provides a variety of goods and services, including durable medical equipment, to support the care of patients as well as to support the caregivers. Teresa began her career as an ICU nurse and then has continued to grow in stature in this healthcare supply chain. And I had the unique privilege of serving as predecessor to Teresa when she became the chair of ARM, and where she really brought our associations, really advanced our work around the clinically integrated supply chain. And last but not least is Eric O'Daffer, who's a research vice president in Gartner's Healthcare Supply Chain Group. Since joining Gartner, the industry has benefited from a lot of Eric's research. And in fact, a lot of Eric's research informed a number of the topics and questions that we'll be addressing today. And he's always very, very willing to participate and support industry forums such as this. Before he joined Gartner, Eric was the CEO of a company that was focused on the physician supply chain. He also led the early value analysis consultants for a division of Cardinal Health. And then a quick note to everybody who is listening today. Please remember to ask any questions at any time throughout this. You can ask the panelists, just go to the Q&A function that's on the left side of your screen. And then we also want you to be part of this conversation. So share your thoughts on what you're hearing from the panelists and about the topics at hand. And you can do that via the chat feature. And that way you'll be communicating not only with the panelists, but also with everybody else who's in attendance today. So let's start today's discussion with a question that really came right out of the abstract. As I mentioned, supply chain in many organizations has really seen its stature elevate, and it's been at the strategic table making decisions during the pandemic when we were facing critical supply shortages. The question is, can supply chain maintain that position? And perhaps more importantly, beyond just emergency preparedness. And so I'd like to ask each of the panelists this question. And Teresa, you've been on the front lines at Vanderbilt dealing with these shortages. And as I recall, it wasn't shortly after a tornado took out your warehouse at the time. So you're on the front lines on many, many issues. Can you tell me a little bit? I mean, I know Vanderbilt clearly recognizes the importance of supply chain, but given your role and your broad view of the industry, what's your thoughts on those questions?
Thanks, Karen. So happy to be here. And I think my initial thought is, why not and why shouldn't we be? And what do we need to do to make sure that that continues to happen and sustains, right? So I really do think it's incumbent upon supply chain leaders across this country to really focus on the moment in time that elevated them, as you said, right, which was the pandemic. And what were the things that they were doing that really their leadership valued? And how do they take that and then extrapolate that out across how do I put this elevated sort of stature into day-to-day operations, and what are my leaders actually looking for from that? And I firmly believe, and it's just based on my experience at Vanderbilt, that when approached with a solid idea from supply chain that can impact the cost, the quality, the outcomes of the organization, can help achieve the strategic goals, the organization is going to listen to that. And supply chain has not always, I don't know that people have always been really willing and comfortable to step into that and to have that voice. But now that voice is there. And now is the time to be able to utilize that. I wouldn't have 3 companies running for Vanderbilt if I didn't use that voice in the past, right? To be able to say, I think this is a good idea and here are the reasons why. And I'm passionate about doing that. Some people may decide that they're happy in the roles that they were in before COVID hit. But for those who are looking for the opportunity, the moment is absolutely here and incumbent upon us to take advantage.
So I wanted to make a real quick follow-up question to that before we go to Eric and then to Randy. And back BC, before COVID, you and I were in New Orleans at a conference, and I remember the CEO of a Chicago-based healthcare system stood up and talked about the fact that if her supply chain leader came to her with an idea to address one of the organization's strategic objectives, that she would be all ears. Mm-hmm. My question to you, and then perhaps Eric and Randy can also follow up on this too, is how in the world can somebody really be cognizant of and identify opportunities to support strategic objectives if they're not sitting with the C-suite and not sitting at that strategic table?
That's a great question. I guess I would answer that by saying some of the best ideas don't come from the supply chain leader, but from the staff themselves, who are experiencing the day-to-day operations and seeing what's working and what isn't. And so many times workarounds are done or Band-Aids are put on that break the process that was intended to be in place because people don't feel like they have the voice to be able to make a change. And so I think it starts with changing the culture within your organization first and foremost, to be able to have staff be able to have the conversation in the staff meeting with the one-up or in a one-on-one, and then to be able to elevate that from there. So many organizations now, healthcare organizations, are having daily huddles, right? Where issues like this are supposed to come up, where there's barriers that are, impacting patient care or impacting throughput or impacting whatever it might be. And so even if staff start to be empowered to start having a voice in a huddle with the nurse managers that are on the call or the COO of the hospital who's on the call, that voice starts to ring in their heads as somebody who's there. They know what they're talking about. They're bringing this forward. They start working together as a team, and pretty soon you start developing that relationship at that level. It doesn't have to be at the chief supply chain officer level. And then, it can grow from there.
So maybe the question is exactly that. It's not necessarily whether somebody's at the C-suite, but they need a path. So if you really want to bring out those good ideas, and we're really talking, huddles and empowering people and not sub-optimizing because of some unintended consequence of some decision that was made at the highest levels of the organization. So really, you're talking about the principles of continuous quality improvement, systems thinking, et cetera. So Eric, I'm curious your thoughts on any of these things that we've started to unpack.
First off, to the first question, Karen, I think should supply chain still be at the table post-pandemic? The answer is absolutely, 100%, million percent. How you get there is the intentional problem. And people like Teresa, who've been in their role and have great credibility, where supply chain is seen strategically, don't have the challenge that most do, which is everybody in the pandemic understood what it meant not to protect your staff, not to protect your patients, what it meant when you didn't have the supplies that meant you could even do surgeries. Coming out of it, I think the key is, hey, how do you take that momentum and keep it going and keep the organization understanding it? And that is just the key problem. And for most supply chain operators who are pretty good at operating, thinking about it from a communication, a marketing standpoint is the hardest thing in this. And I always say, hey, supply chain, senior leaders in the organizations, most IDNs, right, 300 in the country, different levels of maturities, don't wake up every morning knowing the value that supply chain can play. So it has to be sold, and you have to tell them, and you have to reinforce it, and you have to give them those pieces of information so that they can see it. So I guess I say yes, it should stay there, but supply chain leaders should be knowing, hey, this has got to be intentional, and it's not good enough to be a good operator. You've got to be a good communicator of getting that information across.
Yeah, not time for complacency. And we're going to dig into some of those skill sets that you brought up in your answer. And Dr. Bradley, some thoughts from you.
Karen, thank you for allowing me to be here with Teresa and Eric. So I agree with both of them. Should supply chain maintain the seat at the table? Absolutely. Will supply chain maintain the seat at the table? I would like to say yes, but not without changes. And what I mean by that is, to Eric's point, far too many supply chain leaders are operationally minded. They are firefighters. They view themselves as firefighters. They love to be viewed as firefighters. They're so entrenched in doing the work that they themselves don't do a good job of communicating the value of the work they do. And then oftentimes we want to put the onus on those who are in the C-suite to understand and translate why and how the work being done in supply chain is strategic in nature relative to the organization. And what we have to do, we have to flip that. Supply chain leaders have to Eric's point, you got to be not only a great communicator, but you got to also be a great collaborator. Oftentimes we siphon ourselves off, we isolate ourselves from the rest of the organization. And regardless of why that is, that's not necessarily the way to do it. Then we have to be able to coordinate all activities, not just the activities within the supply chain or those within our purview, but what are we doing to step outside the walls of supply chain? So there are very few Teresas. And so the whole point of that is not many people are going to rise to the level of a Teresa. She is a rarity, not only within healthcare, but across most industries and most sectors. But one thing that sets her apart, which I believe many supply chain leaders need to emulate, is you have to be innovation minded. It's not enough to know the strategic initiatives. It's more important to be able to bring strategic initiatives to the forefront that the rest of the C-suite has yet to think about. Supply chain touches nearly every function of an organization. And so if there's any group of leaders who should have the wherewithal and be positioned to move an organization forward, it should be the supply chain leader.
Excellent points, and several that we will dig into with some additional questions. You know, when you think about the culture too, kind of that hero mentality, I would probably argue a lot of healthcare has that, particularly, you know, on the clinical side. You know, we're going to do what's necessary, but that may have contributed to our lack of being the most efficient in terms of how we're allocating resources. Again, a critical place for supply chain. So let's talk about how supply chain moves beyond this, you are strategic in an emergency, to where else can we, to Eric's point, demonstrate and show that value and innovate, to your point, Randy. So, I mean, should we kind of move along into the next place along the resiliency maturity curve, maybe getting into demand planning, et cetera? Or is this really the opportunity to build on that collaboration with clinicians and really start moving down the maturity path to support our move to more value-based healthcare? Eric, I'm going to start with you because I know you've written with some of your colleagues a fair amount about things like demand planning and the need for bi-directional visibility. But certainly don't limit your comments to that if you want to expand on the question.
Thanks, Karen. Maybe I'll focus on the demand planning and the resiliency side, and Teresa can take some of the more clinical stuff and build on demand planning, right? So demand planning in healthcare is behind. I just wrote a note. We're an industry analyst on the high tech side. Casey Kwa came across, and we did some interviews with organizations on where they were with resiliency, where they were with demand planning, and forecasting is a piece of that. You know, the answer on resiliency is the pandemic raised that up, right? We watched it go from 2012, where people could only spell it if a weather-related event came through their area, through business continuity when they started to think about what the impact of the suppliers was, through the pandemic where it affected everybody, and organizations started to put, you know, resiliency as another, you know, leg of the stool or the table of supply chain, along with sourcing, logistics, analytics, clinical alignment, right? Resiliency is now laying there kind of across those at many organizations. And then as you piece it together, that concept of demand forecasting, demand planning layers in, but man, are we early. Ooh, we're early. You know, we came out of those interviews. It's still all, I shouldn't say all, 90% of the interviews focused on PPE. Most of them focused on, well, what do we do with this data, and being an internal focus of using demand forecasting and demand planning, but not getting a lot of buy-in yet from the manufacturing community, most of which happens because nobody represents more than 1% or 2% of their volume. You know, and when you go global and think about these manufacturers globally, it's even less than that. But even in the US, right, 300 health systems, 1,500 independent hospitals still, you know, it's really hard to get that kind of connected end to end. And until we do, it's going to be slow. But there's lots of things that they can put in place, and you got to start somewhere. So we're encouraging it, and we've seen some organizations. I heard one organization in the Midwest hired 12 demand planners. What exactly that means to them, I'm not exactly sure yet. Trying to dig into it, but you know, those numbers, like what happened with analytics years ago, may be coming to a demand planning organization near you. So early stages, but encouraging, I guess.
Okay. And jump over to you, Teresa. And I'd like to expand on the question a little bit, because one of the things that I've also seen during the pandemic is the interrelationship between so many of the strategic objectives around value-based healthcare. We saw it firsthand with COVID. You know, we saw those who are, you know, suffering from some of the social determinants of health or the lack thereof, and more comorbidities as a result of that. You know, they struggled more in terms of their outcomes, et cetera. We look at sustainability, we look at equity, we look at good resource management. All of these seem to have an impact on clinical care and a role with supply chain. So, you know, some thoughts in terms of the initial question, kind of where should supply chain be focusing, but also how can supply chain support kind of these different issues more holistically?
I guess I have an advantage here because I've been thinking about this for a number of years, right? And working towards trying to put processes in place to be able to address value-based care across the continuum, supporting the organization outside the four walls of the traditional hospital. And I think what COVID did was just accelerate that conversation. It accelerated the conversation around telemedicine and the ability for patients and providers to say, hey, this isn't a bad idea. This can work in certain populations in a very positive way. But what do they do after that visit is over and there's a need for that patient, and who is going to fill that need? From what are, you know, we opened a COVID to home program on a dime, right? And we've had over 700 patients admitted to that, and saved multiple hospital bed days for the more critically ill. So how does supply chain respond to that? Well, it's a matter of, they said, we need, and we got it. And you don't have to have the plan that we had in place, but it's to understand, you know, what's the need of the organization. It's your skill set, it's logistics. Figure it out, right? It's just not within your four walls. Just figure out how you're going to do it. And oh my heavens, how do we charge the patient for this, or charge the unit? We can do that. That's all sort of the things that can get done collaboratively behind the scenes with the right people in the finance department and revenue cycle and all those other areas, but do what we do best, which is that logistical piece. I would say from a clinical engagement perspective, you know, um, as far from my perspective, having a clinically integrated supply chain has been absolutely critical for me. But we're going through a journey right now that I think is exemplary of the way that it needs to be in the future. In that we listen, and in supply chain, you listen and then you try and respond to the customer needs, right? And you try and figure out your processes from there. But there are times in that journey where it has to be a bi-directional give between supply chain and between clinical. And we've just started our journey with a new point of view solution. We've been using technology since 2010, but we're going down a new path. We're on an ERP journey that we just kicked off. Believe it or not, Vanderbilt has not had an integrated platform to this date. So the fact that we've done some of the things that we've done without that has been amazing. But my point of that bi-directional is we're getting ready to have a conversation with our clinical teams using the RACI model on what they're going to be responsible for and what we need to be responsible for. And it's not everything, right? There's an accountability that needs to occur and a culture that has to happen across an organization where everybody owns their piece of the pie. And the piece of the pie I'm talking about for clinical is do your documentation. If you document accurately, that helps supply chain do what they need to do to be able to do demand forecasting, like Eric is talking about, to be able to make sure you don't have stockouts, to be able to make sure you're managing the return process. But it's an accountability that has to, a responsibility and accountability that has to occur across all disciplines that I really think is where we need to be working towards positioning ourselves for the future.
I'm really glad you brought that up and kind of that clarity around who's responsible, who's accountable, who has influence, who needs to be consulted, because there's a piece, but you need to have some kind of framework and some kind of governance for this. So I want to build on that question, and I'm going to go to you, Randy, related to areas of responsibility. So this is building off some more Gartner research related to, and I think Gartner and many others have identified the fact that there isn't one supply chain in most hospitals. There's multiple supply chains, and oftentimes they aren't necessarily following a RACI model where people are being consulted and have other influence. They're completely separate and operating, whether it's lab, it's pharma, whether it's med surge, et cetera, food. So one of the things that the Gartner research has talked about is hospitals having, or hospital supply chain having more responsibility. For example, in the area of analytics, an area where you're certainly an expert in that. Randy, what are your thoughts in terms of, should supply chain be owning that, or should it be a separate function and we're looking at, different involvement by supply chain, by clinicians, by other aspects of the healthcare delivery system? Some thoughts on that?
That's a great question. And I've seen a variety of models. I've seen where analytics has been set up as a center of excellence in the middle of the organization where it services all functional areas. And that works fine. I've seen situations where it's been allocated and put under IT, and I believe that's a debacle waiting to happen. And I come right out and say that, and primarily because one of the things we're trying to do, we're trying to elevate the strategic priority and value of these types of initiatives. And when we place them under a function that primarily is viewed as a cost center, then we have relegated it to being that. And that's my greatest concern about. I would love for it to sit in supply chain. To Teresa's point, we traverse nearly over 300 miles just in the medium-sized hospitals on a weekly basis in terms of just moving linens and moving meals. But yet your logisticians in your supply chain function are nowhere to be involved in that. No one is optimizing the route and the flow of materials. And so what oftentimes happens is analytics falls to our quality team. Why? Because they're the keepers and the babysitters of the data that we deem to be important, which tells me that when we talk about clinically integrated supply chain, the things that concerns me the most is that we have to have clinically as a descriptor in front of it. Where else do we do that? If we have a truly integrated supply chain, that essentially means integrated across all functions and areas of the facility. We shouldn't have to highlight the need for it to be clinically integrated. So as much as I would say, let's put it in supply chain, my greatest concern is supply chain does not have the bandwidth to take on another initiative. It's going to be much better served as a center of excellence where it sits in the center of the organization, where we then dole individuals out to various functions on a rotationary basis, 12 to 18 months, bring them back into the center, send someone else out. And now what you get, you have cross pollination. And that cross pollination is going to create a team of analytics professionals who understand the business model, who understands the operating model, and who now can do more than just analyze data. They can then get ahead of trends. And if I could add one thing relative to the conversation around demand planning, Eric is spot on. We have seen two dominant supply chain strategies. One is his supplier focused strategy, which most supply chains traditionally will follow that. The problem is it's a high cost strategy from a supply chain standpoint. A better strategy is demand. The problem is we don't necessarily have the resources to respond. But healthcare is in a much better place than most industries because you're at the point where the demand signal is clean and can be immediate. Most other sectors will kill to have that type of immediate response from a demand signal. But yet we don't focus on integrated business planning. And as a result, we don't emphasize the need and the importance of demand planning. And so what I say is our greatest challenge within COVID was not managing the supply chain. It was a lack of management around the demand chain. The fact that we couldn't identify what was being utilized, where, how, and at how fast. So trying to get to accurate burn rates. And if we're going to move the organization forward, that is where I think is a prime area where supply chain can apply analytics, but not necessarily be the owner of analytics.
So Karen, can I add something onto what Randy said? Because I agree with him completely. You know, trying in the past to lead out of supply chain with some of this, the data and the analytics has been really difficult even for me, right? Because so if you don't, it depends on your organization and where you sit as a supply chain leader and how your supply chain is viewed, whether that voice is even going to be heard or not. And, you know, having the privilege of working with 6 medical directors and having a forum to be able to have this, it was still tough and it's still tough. And so we've gone into more of a model like Randy's talking about, where we're there as part of a support team and we have our expertise and we can add to the conversation, but it's not supply chain driven. You know, it is, the data is driving the conversation within the patient care center with the business manager and the physicians and the financial managers. And supply chain is part of the conversation, but supply chain isn't pulling the groups together to try and disseminate the information. And I honestly, lessons learned, it's working much better than with us trying to lead it.
See, this is such an important, and this is why the three of you are such excellent panelists, because so many times we talk about kind of either or, I own it or you own it. Well, why can't it be both and why can't it be more collaborative? And so it's such an important, Eric, just real quickly, see if you have any comments before I start to switch the topic.
Yeah, just agree on both sides, and especially Randy thinking about this. And I guess I'd just build on it. Even in center of excellence from an analytics standpoint, I still watch organizations struggle with it because it gets prioritized under other projects. And with, you know, supply chain representing, if you combine all the supply chains that you were talking about in the beginning, Karen, it's 37% of the budget. End-to-end cost for a health system is 37% for supply chain. If you undercount it and don't think about it in those terms, and a lot of organizations don't, and things get prioritized in the wrong way, I just end up coming back and thinking, hey, if you own it, then you can do the analytics, you can expand it into the clinical areas. When you don't, then you're relying on somebody else to hopefully see the light and support supply chain in the way that it can bring the most value to the organization.
Well, your point about the percentage of operating expenditure applied to supply chain is so important, because we still in so many organizations count it as the supply expense. And as long as we do that, we're going to focus on beating up suppliers to get the price, the unit price down, and we're not going to be seen as strategic, will be seen as expense management, or an unnecessary evil, if you will. So I want to shift something that you said, Randy, about logistics, building on something that Teresa had said. And if we and Teresa, you also talked about moving care outside of the acute care facility. Instead of that system where it's been built around the supply, which is the hospital and the physician, we need to build our healthcare system around the patient and where the patient is. And I think that logistics and the stat that you referenced, Randy, I remember having a conversation with a cardiologist who was working at Geisinger at the time, and we were talking about supply chain at a non-supply chain conference. And he said, it's interesting. I have a bunch of nurse practitioners who are working on people, they're going and visit patients with heart failure. And he said they love their job, but they were really angry at me the other day. Excuse me. They were angry at me because I had one nurse go in the morning up north, and then she went to the east, and then she went back north, and then she went south. And he goes, doesn't UPS have something about it? They always turn right. Can't we optimize this? So my question goes to you, Teresa, in terms of, as we move care out of the hospital, are you or should we be thinking about not just moving the supplies and the services, but the actual clinicians or the others who are servicing those patients in the community? Some thoughts on how we get there.
We actually have had a multidisciplinary task force that's been working over the past number of months, because we've been approved by CMS to open a formal hospital home program. And so we open our first 24 beds in September. And that whole chain that you're talking about is being addressed from a workflow perspective, because it's not just, sending a patient has to be seen, in their home physically. But if something else goes wrong as well, too, there has to be a response time for somebody to get there as well, too, to do that. And so that is all part of the planning that is going into it, because what's just as important as the logistical planning of routes. So we've purchased technology so I can track my trucks and I know the routes and I can program them, and be able to have feedback coming back into the organization to say the meds were delivered, the supplies were delivered, and everybody, knows that those check boxes were done. But just as important in logistics is to the point about what his nurse practitioners said. You've got to be able to retain those practitioners and their satisfaction and well-being, right? And so this is a new stressor for them going out into homes, because they're now having to assess patients in their homes. They're having to make sure that the home is safe. They're having to look for, barriers to care, et cetera. They don't have to do that when they're seeing patients in the hospital. So you're adding on responsibility. The last thing that they need to be thinking about is, do I go east? Do I do west? Do I do? So it is part of that collaborative process to really make that workflow, not only when they're in the home, a positive experience for them, but also getting them there as well, too. So that is absolutely conversations that we're having.
Excellent. I knew you'd be way ahead of the game on this one. Eric, did you have a comment on that?
Yeah, well, I'm passionate about this, and Teresa's ahead of the game. All the health systems in the country, right, expanding this and thinking about that patient at home. Hopefully the pandemic has accelerated it, but it's still pretty early days on this as well. But really just thinking about, hey, how do we match the supply chain to this changing patient care model? And we've proven as an industry over the last decade that we can do it in the physician offices, right? All these organizations acquired it. There's a platform to do it. Assign a leader in the non-acute space that used to be clinicians. We should be doing the same thing in home care, and tying it in. The challenge is out of the gate, it looks like an additional cost for supply chain. It looks like another service that we're going to provide, and you've got to have kind of a team in place and capabilities. And it just seems daunting to many and like an additional cost that they're not going to get credit for, quote unquote. So I just think thinking about it in a different way, taking that playbook that we did for the non-acute space, expanding this, and just really looking at that all-inclusive patient environment doesn't necessarily mean that they're in a procedure, but just thinks about that health of the patient, brands it almost like retail does for like an omnichannel approach. I just really view this as a tremendous space for providers to do. And if they don't do it, I think there's going to be organizations like CVS that fill that hole. So it's really, as I look at it nationally, I go, hey, don't do it at your own cost. And do it could be partner, do it could be build it yourself. There's a number of ways to go after that. But those are my thoughts. And I guess it's another place where I view it and go, hey, want to shine a light on organizations that are breaking new ground, doing it great.
Well, Eric, and I think to your point, it goes back to we've been planning CareFluent Connect, right, for several years now, and literally getting ready in July 1 to start there. Payer contracts are always a ton of fun, right? So that's what we've been working on recently. But we were able, when you think about that added cost, because you're right, it typically would be the operations and logistics team within the hospital that now has to figure out how to do this. Well, so I've got CareFluent where I've got trucks, I've got drivers, I've got a routing system, for those trucks. So we're able to use the synergies, and we're building it so that, okay, we've got a patient being admitted to hospital to home. They need to have supplies. We've got the totes, we've identified common supplies for this diagnosis, the drugs in there. And oh, by the way, the truck's also running for patients who need DME delivered to their home, right? So we're finding those synergies. So we're actually not adding costs because it's getting paid under a DRG. You're not getting any more money for it, right? So I think I'm empathetic to those who are trying to figure out how to do this without having some infrastructure already in place to help support it, because it is additional work and burden on an already very burdened, usually very lean supply chain team that's trying to handle the business within just the four walls every single day.
And this speaks to that innovation point that you made before, Randy. Did you want to make another comment?
Yeah, absolutely. Because Teresa hit it right on the head. You've got the two I's. You've got infrastructure and you've got investment. And it's not just investing in the infrastructure, but investing in your personnel. Let's face it, when we look at the core competencies and the skill sets of the vast majority of our healthcare supply chain professionals, many of them will be hard pressed to try to get a job outside of healthcare and the supply chain function. And it's not because they're not capable, it's because we don't invest in them. We don't develop them. We don't train them appropriately. We don't give them an actual career ladder. And so when you think about this now, when you want to throw something on in terms of managing what we consider to be direct to patient type services, or where you're trying to optimize clinicians and so forth, those are things that they're just not capable of doing right now in the vast majority of organizations around the country. And even more so when you get out to rural areas, it's even worse. And so what my greatest concern, Karen, and I know this is a passion of yours, is we begin to perpetuate greater health disparities and inequities by way of these changing care models, because those things aren't front of mind. We even saw this with respect to telehealth and virtual care during COVID. But you want to know who was greatly impacted the most? It was people who already had challenges getting access to care because they didn't have the infrastructure in place to even take advantage of those virtual services. And so I love the initiative that Vanderbilt is doing. And I think it becomes a model that so many organizations around the country can follow. But another thing that Vanderbilt does well, and primarily because of Teresa's leadership, is they invest in their people. I look at her leadership team and I am in awe of how not only she's built the team, but the way she develops the team. She is the type of leader who thinks about succession planning well before you should even be thinking about it, such that if she ever decided to step away for whatever reason, the ship continues to run. That's what I call a sustainable supply chain organization. It's not about being green and eco-friendly. It's about, can we keep the ships moving regardless of what comes up?
Absolutely. And just a really quick plug. Our next segment in today's educational forum is going to be looking at some new data on succession planning. And then in the third panel, we're going to talk a little bit about some of these financial implications. And so I'm using that as my excuse to jump over to another topic that's really building on what you just said, Randy.
Hey,
And
Karen,
that
can I add one more thing before you transition?
absolutely.
So just building on Randy's comment and connecting back to the initial concept that talked about, getting a seat at the a chair at the C with the C-suite. All these things are interconnected, right? When you think about going out into the home care and matching to virtual care, there's trade-offs with supply chain costs and the total cost of delivering care that align all to that clinically integrated supply chain concept that we talk about. And until you can get the C-suite to buy into, a compensation structure that doesn't just tie to savings at the sourcing level, that thinks about those trade-offs, that thinks about this more as a story problem than skill and drill arithmetic on go to these vendors and reduce these costs. I think we'll have a challenge. So this is just another thing to interweave into that strategy that goes, hey, we're expanding this, but the organization really has to buy into it strategically along with supply chain.
Think about it. These facilities they are enablers and developers of the community. And I know a lot of time we look to Amazon and it can be sort of a lightning rod, if you will. But one thing I will give them credit for is a mantra that they have, which is this: not everything that we do is profit earning, but everything that we do is trust earning. Think about what we're doing in the communities to engender the trust that when you're at your greatest point of need, we're here for you. And those types of things that Eric is referring to, those are the things that help to entrench us in the community.
Critical points. And that role of trust and those skill sets, those competencies. And so that's really my next question, Randy. And I'll start with you. There was another survey done recently, Supply Chain Sherpas, and they were looking at the importance of certain competencies or attributes and preparedness. And one of the things they said had the biggest gap was around a growth and learning mindset within supply chain. And if you think about all these, I would call them opportunities that we've got as healthcare is evolving from a system that takes care of the sick to hopefully a system that produces optimal health for everybody in a community. How do we overcome that? How do you're training people, at the University of Tennessee and with other clients. Teresa, I'll probably come to you after that. I mean, how do we start changing that? Do we need to recruit differently? Do we need to offer different kinds of development? What's the answer?
There are quite a few things here, Karen, and what I have tried to do on behalf of the University of Tennessee is put myself in a position to work with health systems who are in need of supply chain talent and connecting them with that talent. But here's what we often run up against, and we see the same thing in public procurement. We see very old job descriptions that don't necessarily resonate with the talent that's being produced today. And so what happens is you hire them in, they stay 2 or 3 months and they realize this is not what I signed up for, this is not supply chain, and they leave you. And then you look at compensation packages. You'd be surprised to hear how many supply chain directors have come to me and want to offer an hourly rate. You're not going to get top talent offering hourly rate. It just doesn't work that way. And so what has to happen is the mechanisms within the organization, the structural the structural pieces have to change to where, going back to where we started this, if in fact supply chain is going to be viewed as a strategic asset and a corporate capability, we must treat it that way. We wouldn't dare go out and hire a CPA and look to offer them an hourly rate. We wouldn't dare go out and hire someone in the C-suite and think that we can get them for pennies on the dollar. And so that's it. The other thing is this. I find that healthcare entities, particularly health systems, do a poor job of networking when it comes to the institutions that are actually producing top talent. What I mean by that is they'll show up when you have career fairs, but by that time, what they fail to realize is many individuals who are in that market already have established relationships that started from the day they stepped foot on campus. You can't show up when they're a senior and expect that they're now going to pay attention to you, because you take the Gartners of the world, you take the McKinseys, you take the Deloittes and the EYs, they have been creating ambassadors on campus where they grab them as freshmen and then they become ambassadors for that organization. And with every student they talk to, everything is about, you should look at this organization here. Healthcare is nowhere to be found. Not only there, but even broader. Life sciences holistically is struggling to do that. What I believe we could be doing is, with respect to whether it's the Bellwether League, whether it's ARM, and whether it's other like-minded associations, partnering together and building these, what I call career development portals, to where we help these entities understand how to recruit, how to attract and hire, and then most importantly, how to retain. And I'm going to end with this last piece here. There was a study that we did with Deloitte, and one of the things that we found is this: when you look at the top talent, that means the talent, what we call the digital talent of the future, organizations who are able to attract and retain them are the ones who are digitally minded. Doesn't mean that they're great at digital, it means they think digitally. And so that's one thing that healthcare has to be prepared to do. So I recognize that some of these are cultural, but some of these are just climate. Climate is much easier and faster to turn than the culture itself. It just takes a willingness and an individual or a group of individuals who are willing to push against the grain.
Eric, I saw you smile when Randy mentioned the job descriptions, because I know that was one of the recommendations in one of your research notes. Make a quick comment, and then I'd be curious, Teresa, how are you handling the changing job descriptions as supply chain and healthcare are both evolving?
Yeah, well, Randy nailed it, right? Legacy job descriptions are the killer. But it starts with getting the position of the leader elevated in my view. Chief Supply Chain Officer, it means great things for the organization and supply chain, because that means you value the top, and then you can hire VPs at the level of the first line leaders that then create succession plans and just show the respect and the understanding of the supply chain role that it plays. But yeah, you've got to, the work that's happened on that level, at those description levels and at the comp level, are just mission critical. So getting this aligned, we've got lots of things. And Karen, I don't know if you're going there later, but these things that are tied to the mission that gets driven around supply chain and where we're going to drive people. I think there's also a challenge with environmental, social, and governance issues in healthcare that we don't even know yet. Right, we're at the tip of the iceberg with these new employees that are coming through that we need to recruit. That supply chain is going to look like a digitally antiquated environment and potentially an ESG compromised industry. So you combine that with a little lack of compensation, and you've got a real problem building, retaining that talent.
Yeah, we're going to circle back to that exact point. But Teresa, you're on the front lines. How are the job descriptions changing?
I think the more important question is, how are organizations changing to meet the needs of the job descriptions from a mindset of what healthcare has traditionally done? So, I mean, when you think about where dollars go from a compensation perspective, they weren't traditionally going to the frontline supply chain people or to the managers or directors. And so many organizations have adopted, we have the $15 an hour minimum wage, right? So that at least was a step in the right direction to start being able to get some individuals to be interested in coming even through the door, right? At a talent level that we would want. We've put professional development policies in place and plans in place to allow for that development of that front line all the way up through the vice presidents, and to be able to take advantage of that for their career advancements. But here's the issue. I don't know very many supply chain teams that are not just as lean as can be. And to ask a frontline person to sit and watch a webinar like this and take time out of their day to do that, or after their busy day to do it, at home at night, if they even have, to Randy's, if some of them even have the technology to be able to do that at home, it's overwhelming for them. It's just overwhelming to layer one more thing on their day, because what they're valuing right now, unfortunately, is the paycheck. And taking that home, and they're not thinking about that next step all the time. And so we have to continue to think about, how do we make it easier on them to try and want to develop and to try and want to participate. And you've got some folks who are naturally going to gravitate towards that, but inherently it's that line staff to manager level that I think we need to try and figure out a better way of doing it, because I just still don't have the right answer for that. Even when you're trying to get people to sign up for their benefits, having to give them computers to all get in a room because they don't have computers to do it from home, right? So there's disparity across the systems, just within the way that it exists right now. And so I think it sounds really great, and we have all these plans and ideas to do things. But what it ends up leading to is that I've got vice presidents who they're awesome. I mean, they're just awesome. But boy, oh boy, can they revert to that firefighter mode that Randy talked about really fast. And just take it. I'm going to own it because my staff is struggling because we're so lean. And so I'm going to go and do this. And trying to get them into that strategic mindset is, you need to be looking at it from this perspective. It's difficult on a day-to-day operational perspective to do it.
I don't know the answer to this, right? This is a challenge, but if you look at it, there's no greater place within a health system for leverage to people and technology to the expense that we control, right? So if you buy into that's 37% of the operating expense from the benchmarks, the other benchmark is that of that 37%, only 1.5% of that expense is supply chain people and technology to drive it. So resources that are driving it. So you've got this huge leverage point that, just like the C-suite doesn't wake up every morning thinking about it and understanding it, HR doesn't get it either. And it's just easier to keep those legacy job descriptions and, oh, you're just moving stuff or buying stuff. It's not that complicated, but there's a real leverage opportunity that's lost. I don't know how to exactly fix it.
Eric, you just nailed it, man. Even the supply chain director that I was speaking to a week ago, he had to work hand in hand with HR to help them become better abreast of the landscape. Here's what's out there. Here's what we're trying to do. Here's what we're trying to achieve. Let me help you help me. And I think that's where it comes, right? Because we can't expect the HR professional to really know what needs to be done and how it needs to be done. That's where the supply chain leader, to Teresa's point, if we stop jumping into the fire, pulling the hose, then we can be in those other rooms having these other conversations that help minimize the likelihood of those fires. And so you hit it right on the head.
These are such critical points, and such, this is I'm going to ask a question that is going to seem to simplify what is an absolutely critical issue. So bear with me, but I'm actually going to combine a couple of questions since we are getting to the end of our time together. I had looked at a stat the other day that talked about 2/3 of supply chain positions, and this is looking across industries, are held by men, and that 80% of those jobs, except for the entry-level jobs, are held by non-Hispanic whites. So should we be, as part of all of these other things that you're looking at, should we also be in our recruitment and our development looking at how do we broaden the diversity of the supply chain workforce? And my other question is, again, this is a Gartner stat I read in some Gartner research about, on average, the mid-manager, I think it is paid about 23% less than a similar position in other industries. And that it's really the only industry where you have somebody at that managerial level oftentimes making less than $100,000, which can be a good salary, but comparable to other supply chain positions. And given the task at hand, the opportunity at hand, I think maybe we'll do a round robin very quickly. Maybe start with you, Randy, on this topic.
Yeah, Karen, to the diversity point, I think it's something that we have to be mindful of, but not necessarily deliberate about. And the reason I say this is because oftentimes when we become overly deliberate when it comes to trying to ensure a diverse workforce, then we unintentionally disenfranchise other populations. But if we're mindful about it, then what it's saying is I'm not going into this with a critical eye of saying, here are the attributes of the individual, as much as I'm looking for, as I said, here's the talent that I need. I always say, if you hire for skills, skills are going to be pigeonholed. Talent is malleable. You always want a person that can adjust and evolve with the organizations. And here's another thing. If you will just look at the data will tell you a more diverse workforce is a more innovative workforce because we bring different perspective, different experiences, different thought processes, And when we pull those things together, to your point, it's not an or, it's an and diversity is an and.
So if we're attracting that talent, and maybe I'll go to you, Eric, one of the things that, because we tend to pay less in healthcare than other supply chain positions around the world, a lot of times it's like, well, you can come and change the world, and the data does show that supply chain professionals have a greater percentage says, hey, I'm having a societal impact. I'm making a difference in the world. But that doesn't necessarily seem to be enough that's going to attract the kind of talent we need. So, Eric, do we need to pay more? Do we need to do something different? Is there, again, kind of taking in Randy's comment about, how we approach this. So we're really looking at that talent who can grow with the needs of healthcare.
Well, like everything, no surprise, it's not an either or, in my opinion. It's a combination of many things. And I would agree, we've got to be better, intentionally better on diversity and inclusion. For women, we were a little bit better than the industry average, for 19% in the senior leader positions. We're 24%, ran these numbers last year for us. So we're making some progress. And on the pay side, I think when you take the average, it doesn't tell the whole story. And I claim that on the pay side, we've got a haves and have-nots. We've got some, and you can see it at the senior leadership roles that we see all the time, right? Our industry turns over the senior leader every year, 15 to 20% of those turnover. I think the pandemic's going to accelerate a little bit for a variety of reasons. But you've got these systems that are paying some really large dollars for their top talent. And I lose a little bit of my visibility at the line workers, but usually it follows that, right? Senior leadership gets paid, then everybody kind of gets paid. And we've got some places that are paying industry comparable wages for the same size organization. And we've got some that are paying a third of the industry wage for a position. So I claim we end up having, it's kind of like supply chain maturity across the 300 IDNs. We've got haves and have-nots, and you've got to bring up, the far right side of the bell curve is there. You got the middle that you got to bring along, and then hopefully you can pull the tail at some point.
Okay. Teresa, we'll have you offer the closing comment on this because we are unfortunately out of time. But just some thoughts on this. What's your biggest challenge recruiting the talent you need or developing that talent?
So I'm going to hang on what Randy said first and foremost, because it really is, it is about being mindful, but it really is looking for that most talented individual who can fill the seat on the bus that you need to have filled with the skill sets that you need. And so I have an extremely diverse team, and, being one of those 24%, Eric, I've been very fortunate to be able to given a magic wand to be able to fill those positions all through our supply chain with the right candidates. It isn't always about money. It is sometimes about the culture of the organization, the name of the organization, what somebody wants to do from a professional or even sometimes a personal perspective to gain fulfillment for them. And so I think it's incumbent upon when you're doing interviews and you're looking for individuals, what is it they're looking for? If they're looking for money, they're probably not going to be the right person for me if that's the only thing that's motivating them, right? But I will tell you, if I find the right person, and back to those goofy job descriptions that people have, right? If I find the right person with the skills, I have no problem going to HR and fighting for a higher salary than what was originally thought about, and being able to have those conversations and pulling that off, because then you want to make sure you don't lose them, right? You're silly if you just don't have the ability to go back to your HR person and say, we're not going to lose this talent and you need to adjust this, and then deal with some of the downstream impacts of that later on through equity, et cetera. But I think it's incumbent upon the leaders to really fight the battle to get the right people on their teams.
And Bellwether League is about leadership, and I couldn't I don't think we could end. I hate to end, but I don't think we could end on a better point. I want to thank all three of you, Randy, Eric, Teresa, for your time and your valuable perspectives and experience on these topics. I also want to thank everybody who has joined us for this panel. And we're going to go into a brief intermission right now. So I'd like you to do take a look at the list of companies that will be displaying on the screen during the intermission. These are the companies that are absolutely critical to the sponsorship and the support of the Bellwether League and our ability to be able to bring together real leaders and real luminaries such as Eric and Randy and Teresa. Do join us back at the bottom of the hour at 2:30 p.m. Central Time. At that time, Bellwether co-founder Jamie Kowalski will be presenting the latest results of research he's been doing for a number of years related to succession planning. And it's going to talk about a number of the issues related to, what's the impact of the pandemic in terms of on our current leadership? Are they going to stay? Are they enthused? Are they just exhausted and I'm done? And do we have that next generation of leaders? And are we doing what we need for them to step into those next positions? And then finally, we hope you'll stay around for our final panel where we're going to address some of these issues. We're going to look at this evolution of the clinically integrated supply chain that Teresa has really been a national leader in, and looking at the role of finance. And can that role of finance take us from away from expense management and maybe to the results of the clinically integrated supply chain, our ability to improve quality, reduce variation, lower costs, does that help Teresa in those very fun processes of negotiating payer contracts, just as an example, but what is that role of finance as we build on clinical and supply chain integration? So thank you again to the panelists. Thank you to our sponsors, and thank you to everybody who has joined us. And please make sure to come back and join us for our next session at the bottom of the hour. Thank you again.
Welcome back, everyone. As a reminder, you can submit your questions via Q&A and use the chat box to engage with the speakers. I would now like to introduce Jamie Kowalski, who started to produce the survey on supply chain leadership topics in 2015. Back then, nearly 50% of supply chain leaders surveyed had planned to retire in the next 3 to 5 years. Let's join Jamie, Foundation co-founder and survey creator, to see what has changed and what may be in store for the future.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me for this presentation. This is going to be a presentation of the report on the healthcare supply chain leadership succession planning survey results that we've conducted in 2021 and previously, and I'll get to more of that as we go along. But before we go any further, I want to thank the people who made this possible. But special thanks go to a very good colleague of mine, Mary Starr, who's the vice president at Green Health Exchange. She was also inducted to the Hall of Fame of the Bellwether League back in 2018, not that long ago. Served as a board member from 2010 to 2016 and was the treasurer for the last 4 years. She was the liaison between getting the information, getting it into the software, bringing it out of the software and putting it into some sort of form that we could use and glean information from and make this presentation. So thanks very much to Mary for her work on this. I've been doing surveys of the healthcare industry, the supply chain executives, the executives they report to or whatever for over 30 years. And it's been frequently a topic for me is succession planning and leadership. Not so much succession planning, except for the most recent 3 surveys. That was this year's, the one in 2016 and the one in 2015. And the finding of that survey was pretty scary, actually, disturbing in some cases. It said that there are supply chain leaders planning on retiring or leaving their current position at a rate that no one believes we can keep up with to find qualified people to take those positions once they become vacant. Also, less than half of the people who filled out the survey had a written succession plan for the supply chain leader position. We can't have that. We had that in 2016. In fact, it was just a little bit more, maybe a 1 or 2% more that did not have it, but we haven't made any progress. We looked at the supply chain leader profile, those who filled out the survey, and basically it looks like this. Left-hand side is the position, their title, et cetera. And then on the right-hand side, it's the type of organization that they're working with or for. And it looks pretty similar to that of the industry as a whole. We asked about the person's formal education. Lots of master's degrees this time, more than last time, 5 years ago. And what's interesting is if you look at the pie chart for 2016, almost at midnight or 12 o'clock high, there's a little slice of pie. I can't tell you what kind of pie it is, but it's kind of olive colored. 4% did not have a degree of any kind. No bachelor's degree, no of arts or science or whatever. That is gone in 2021. Something's going on, and I think what's going on is people are recognizing the complexity and the challenge of managing at a leader level of supply chain management and having a degree and having that experience of gaining that degree behind the candidates is making a big, is helping the people make a good decision on who's going to fill some of these positions. We asked what your major was, because even as in an MBA, you can have probably 6 or 8 different majors to choose from. And we just wanted to see what that looked like. Well, it looks like a slightly more sliced up pie on the left for this year. And we found that there was a little more of clinical people with a clinical degree. And that's not surprising given the essence, or not the essence, the focus on value analysis. We also see that there's a few in social sciences, not a lot. And the largest group is, well, it's either business, and that could mean a number of things, and then supply chain. And supply chain has grown significantly since 2015. When you think about it, there are many more universities that have supply chain degree programs, master's degree, bachelor's degree, the visiting student, the virtual student now. The offerings are, it's just tremendous that it's out there because this is a industry that needs this kind of education. And hopefully we're going to have people ready to roll when the other people start retiring and going elsewhere. We asked the people who fill out the survey, how many total years in your career? Could be 5 years, 25 years, whatever it is. How many total years did you spend in the highest supply chain position for that enterprise? What could have individual hospital, multi-hospital system, whatever it was. And if you look, things have changed quite a bit. It's kind of a changing of the guard, if you can call it that. Lots of supply chain leaders have been in less than 5 years, and a lot more than were in that situation all the way back to 2016. And then it starts to flatten out a little bit until you get to years 21 to 25. I can't tell you why it's different other than to say that there's turnover, and we're going to see more people in the new positions in the early years, and then gradually they'll feed into the rest of the pie chart, or the bar chart here pretty nicely. So that's a quick run through of what type of people filled out the survey, their backgrounds. Now we want to talk a few minutes about pandemic. I mean, everybody's talked about it. But one of the things that I found, and what really bothered me, and the reason we put it in the survey itself, was the healthcare supply chain was taking a beating. And in some cases, I don't think it was fair. There were politicians, there were news people on TV or the radio, all saying about, oh, gee, the healthcare supply chain just totally failed. They can't get the PPEs and they're not getting them. And the patients are all suffering and the staff are, all the chaos. Yeah, it was there, but was it really the healthcare supply chain, or was it the world supply chain, which is a whole different animal? I'm not sure that people really distinguished enough between the healthcare supply chain, but we also have to recognize that, yes, it didn't work the way it should. And that's what we found, and that's what everybody basically admitted, and now we got to do something about it. So one of the things is, well, we need a plan, a written plan, like disaster planning, if I remember that correctly from my years being in supply chain management. Who has a written plan in relative to dealing with a pandemic? Unfortunately, about half and half. We then asked them for the tactics or the strategies, the skill sets that they used when they were dealing with this pandemic. And not surprisingly to me anyway, and I'm sure everybody listening to this will probably agree, is forecasting and demand planning. That seemed to be the biggest item, and the thing that was tried to at least be used to get through the pandemic. So that was one of the big things that we need to be aware of, that we need to do something more sophisticated, more with more technology, et cetera, to get our hands on that issue. We then asked, and I'll pause for a second for you to stop your laughter here. How well did your part of the supply chain perform? And gee, surprise, surprise, 86% said very well. Well, that's not what I guess via the grapevine. It's not what I heard through the people in the media. They may have been wrong, but that's not exactly what we heard. So I'm not sure what they used to say we did very well. And the very worst score here was adequately. There was nothing less than adequate. And we also know that that wasn't always the case either. So I'm not sure how maybe we posed the question in the wrong way and didn't quite get at it. But the issue here is they felt they did a pretty good job of their own for their own operation, but we're not at all happy with the supply chain partners, the healthcare suppliers, at all. They said they let them down. They said the GPOs let them down, and I guess that would be the only two other players that would be involved here. But it's a situation that did not work out very well. Then we asked, okay, even though you did very well, was there something that you would say there's plenty of room for improvement? And demand planning and forecasting comes up again. It's mentioned several times on this page, and in the end of the report, which we're not going to show, I'll just tell you that it's there. The repetition of demand planning or forecasting in some way of saying or mentioning it just happened over and over and over again. So we just decided to roll it up into a summation, and you can see there's some other things there, but the demand planning was really important, and we need to do a much better job all the way around. That includes with all the business partners, even the ones that we said didn't do a very good job for us. We have to bring them together and say, we're going to make this work. What do you need? Here's what I need. And it can work. We just have to figure out how to make it work. Okay, succession planning. Well, all right, here was the question that came out in the opening statement here. If it's your choice, and that is a very important distinction, if it is your choice, how many more years do you intend to work until you retire? All right, if you look at 2016 and 2021, it comes out to be, if you add up the slices in the pie, up through years 4 to 6 years, rather, that choice, you'll see that in 2021 it was 41%, and in 2016 it was 38%. They're going to be gone within that 6-year period. Sometime between 1 year and 6 years, they will be gone. Now keep that number in your head till we get to the discussion about, how we're going to backfill those positions, if you will. We asked the executives, are you even aware of a retirement intention or timeline for the person who is your supply chain leader? Most said yes, they are. Supply chain is something that apparently is of interest, but they haven't followed up with some of the other planning, since only half of them have a succession plan. But 82% said, yeah, I'm aware. Well, you got to have something other than I'm aware in order to work through it. So it's a serious thing that is going to continue to come back and get underlined as we go along here. All the responders said to the question, rather, do you have a formal written supply chain leader succession plan? And weirdly, I think, is almost identical to the answer to the question of, do you have a pandemic plan? About 50-50. Some people would say, I'm too concerned about being told when I reveal to my boss, when we have the heart-to-heart talk, and I say, hey, I intend to be out of here in about 2 years, that the boss is going to say, oh, you do, huh? Well, you know what? We've got somebody in mind that could fill your spot, so you can go home today and you don't need to come back. I don't think things happen quite that severely and that poorly, I'll say. Obviously, that would be poorly handled. But I think that there's a fear that I can't tell my boss that I'm going to leave in 2 years. Who knows what will happen to me after that point? So if you're too afraid to be candid, you're not going to put together a written supply chain leader succession plan. That's unfortunate, because you got to get past that fear. And hopefully you're on the same wavelength, and we're doing this for a good reason. Then we asked the supply chain leaders if they even conferred with their boss while they were preparing the plan. Now, remember, only half of them have a plan. And most of that half said that, yes, we did confer. Now, I don't want to get into semantics here, but someone could say, this is what I think confer means. And someone else could say, this is what I think confer means. So either way, we got to be careful with the semantics. We tried to pick something that was pretty neutral, easy to understand, and easy to define. But we see that most of them that have a plan at least did do that conferring. And then we asked the golden question. So if you don't have a formal succession plan, why? What's up? Well, if you look at the supply chain leader thoughts about it and the percentages associated with it on the pie, I would call those excuses rather than strong reasons or strong, just an explanation for why I don't have it. I mean, never thought about it. No one told me to do it. I didn't have the time. I don't know how to do one. Well, those are all maybe true, but are they acceptable? Should we allow that to be acceptable in a situation of this nature and of this importance? The C-suite executive also never thought about it 50% of the time. And no one directed them, nor did they direct anybody to create a plan. Well, they're all guilty as charged, I guess, in this case. We got to break that down and get people to work on these things and get them together so that we can have the plans that are needed, in particular this situation where the timelines don't match the people leaving versus the people that might be available to take these positions. Next, how many of these years that you've worked in however many provider organizations, hospitals, health systems, were you a member of the C-suite, official member, not just once in a while brought in to give an update or something like that, but you're there for every meeting. You see all the minutes, like all the other people in the C-suite. Some of this obviously was affected by turnover that's occurred between 2016 and this year. And some of it is because a lot of people are finding it very challenging to fill these positions with good quality people. Then we also asked, well, if you've never been a member of the C-suite, would you consider extending your career or your role at that job you're in today if they made you, if they, gave you the sword tap on each shoulder and said you're now a member of the C-suite? And interestingly enough, to me anyway, is 59% this year said, yes, I would consider extending my career just to be in the C-suite. We also asked those who were thinking about leading, are you concerned about who will be your successor? Because back in 2016, they were not too worried about it. Even if I don't know anybody, the hospital's going to find somebody, or our organization will. And I love the one at the very bottom. No, it's not my concern once I leave. Yeah, I guess that's pretty obvious, but not necessarily a great approach to what your responsibilities are. Again, as a leader, if you are a supervisor, a manager, whatever, you might be able to say, that isn't my job to find my own replacement, or at least contribute to that effort. So it's changed, it's better, it's not great. And we got to be aware of that, because that is the opinion or the feeling of some of the folks that are in the current supply chain leader positions. Then we asked, okay, are there some people where you work and have skills, knowledge, attributes, the potential maybe to fill your position? They may not be the supply chain leader because you are, but maybe they have other world and job experiences that can be transitioned into a supply chain leader role. And they may be somebody who's on your staff. We're going to get to that one in just a minute. But the supply chain leader said, yes, we think that there are. We also asked if there was an adequate number of people in the industry as a whole. Now, they just said, yeah, we think we've got people in our organization. But when they looked at the industry as a whole, they weren't so positive. 55% said, no, I don't think we have enough, or we have the right ones, or the ones that are there are as ready as, at least I think, they need to be. It's a big gap. So and you might say it's an inconsistency, but I think it makes sense. The whole industry, hey, no, I'm not convinced. My organization, I'm more familiar with it, the people, the needs, et cetera. I can see where they could have a difference of opinion on those two things. Then we said, is there someone working for your organization who is prepared right now to take this leader position? And the no's were more than the yeses in both groups, the C-suite and the supply chain leader. And it's a significant difference for the supply chain leader. So they know, or they don't know, if they have somebody who's prepared right now to take that leadership position if and when you leave that organization. We've got to work through these differences. We've got to be really creative and look at people we might not have looked at before, and look at potential, and look at, we'll get to them in just a minute here, the characteristics of the individual and what that means and what you have to have in order to be a successful leader. And then the last one, I believe this is there someone who works for your organization right now that with additional mentoring and grooming, as we would call it, could be ready in time? Okay. By the time you're ready to go, that person now was, let's say, a lieutenant, and now is going to be the chief. The answer here again primarily is yes. There's a little bit of I don't know, and that's concerning, but it's not a huge number. So hopefully we're not going to have a problem with that. And if they don't know now, they can find out that they've got a jewel here that needs to be developed and be given a chance, or you don't. And if you don't, then you take the steps that are going to get you where you need to go. Then we said, okay, is there someone who you have been personally mentoring able to take that position after you depart? And again, high numbers for yes, and that's a good sign if they're correct. And I'm not second guessing anybody or suggesting that they're not telling the truth. They just might not really know. They just have a feel for it, rather than I know this person really can handle it. They've been tested. I've tested them. They've been given assignments and prepared to the point where I would feel comfortable with them taking over. And I'm hoping my boss would too. And then as we were really digging deeper, we asked the question, well, is this person really ready? Like completely ready, or almost ready, or not too close to being ready? And unfortunately, the almost ready is the biggest group. And then the not close is the next biggest group. And the little slice of purple pie on the left side is, yeah, they're completely ready. Not good enough. Not good enough. Given where the numbers are and where the trend line appears to be and is going, that's not good enough. All right. So then we said, if you found the right person, or if you knew the right person right now, how many years would it take them to get ready for the supply chain leader position? Now, this again answers or addresses part of the question that says, how fast are these vacancies going to occur? And so we use the 1 to 3 years, the 4 to 6 years, and the more than 6, because it was the biggest piece of the pie. It was 41% at least this year combined. And what they're saying is that, okay, we could be ready in 69% of the leaders this time said we could be ready in up to 3 years. The rest of them said 4 to 6 years. And that's where you start to get into trouble, where we have too many leaving, not enough quality people to fill those spots. Now, one other question we asked was the background. It says, do you have an idea of other background experiences, places that they've worked, departments that people have worked, where they might be able to take some of those skills and transition them into a supply chain leader? Most of them said, no, we really think they need to come from supply chain. 73% of the, I'm not sure, rose color, I guess, slice of the pie. But we know that there are people who have moved from senior administration, the C-suite. Maybe was the president of a hospital, and the hospital was either closed or bought out or whatever it might be. And that person took a corporate supply chain position in a larger IDN, or just a different IDN, and it worked out very, very well. Finance, we've seen numerous people in finance that might have been a controller or was a VP of finance, but not the CFO, take those types of positions and do very well with them. So it's something that we need to consider. And again, we need to keep our eyes open as to who might be out there that we could possibly work with and get this taken care of. All right, I mentioned a minute or two ago, leadership characteristics. What are we talking about? Here's what we're talking about. One, what is your educational background? Okay, we already said that, there's very little future for people without at least a bachelor's of science or arts degree. And most of the people now getting the supply chain leader positions are a master's degree. And there are plenty of choices in that grouping. If a certification is of interest and required, it was clear that AHRMM has a certification program that they believe would be the one that they would say you have to be certified by AHRMM in addition to the education, in addition to the experience, the knowledge, the skill sets, et cetera. So it's not one thing alone, it's a combination of things that are going to help us select the right people or groom the right people who have the background and can get those skills and those qualifications up where maybe it's not evident right then and there. Then we asked, which source is best able to provide the supply chain management technical knowledge and skills? And in this case, if you look at the purple one on the far left, the bar, it's universities with supply chain programs. Again, could be bachelor's, but a lot of them are master's degrees. That got a pretty good number of marks. However, the one with the most was you and your team, as if this were going to be an on-the-job training initiative. And maybe we asked the question the wrong way. Maybe it wasn't clear enough, but it really concerns me. How does the person who has the job and is planning on leaving, how much in advance can they hire the person and really give them the opportunity to learn to be the leader, not just learn how to be a leader? I don't know how that can work. It may work in places. I've just never ran into it where it's been positive. And obviously we can only go so deep with some of these questions. So you'll have to bear with me on that one. And this is probably the most important message that I think is in this whole packet of slides, the whole survey. The general skill set, which one is more important? Is it leader and management skills, or is it supply chain technical skills, meaning inventory management, distribution, production, et cetera? Those are the technical skills, not technical like technology, being able to work a software program or anything like that. These are the technical skills associated with supply chain management. And look at the difference. 93% said a leader and management skill combo is what is absolutely more important than the supply chain technical skills. We asked the people who filled out the survey, the supply chain management skills that you think are the most important for a supply chain leader to excel in order to be a success in that position. Then we asked about those characteristics or traits. And it's interesting, they matched up pretty darn well. And the number one thing, a big picture view. I'm not just somebody who cuts POs. I'm looking at supply chain management throughout the enterprise, not just my department, not just this department, not just this category of product, but the whole shooting match. And if that is done, they have a much better chance of being successful in the leadership role. So you have some differences in the top 5 ranking, but they're all of the same, rather are in each of the group's top 5. Okay, if we're looking for leaders, where are we going to go? Well, in 2016, we asked the question, what about outsourcing? What about contracting for somebody to take over the supply chain leader position? If you don't have your own personal candidates, or you don't want to go through the search yourself, you just want to, as the phrase used to be, rent a manager. But it didn't fare very well in 2016. 92% said, oh, no, that's not good for us. We're not going to have that happen. Well, it improved this year. It's now 75% saying, no, that's not a very good idea. But when you have to get creative and look at all your options, this might be a good option for some organizations. Many of those companies had very good training programs to cover what universities were not around to do back in those days. If you answered yes to that previous question, which is the most likely source your organization would choose as the contractor. Not surprising to me anyway. I don't think it would be surprising to anybody on this call. GPOs, they're doing it now. There are GPOs that are placing managers that are their employees in with the organizations that they have a relationship with for contracting and the rest of the GPO services. 60% said, yeah, that would be a good choice. 20% said consulting firms, and usually the consulting firms are more for interim management, short term. The organization thinks that they're going to find somebody or they're grooming somebody, and they'll say, well, we'll take 3-4 months or maybe 6 months, and by then we'll have the right person and we can put in the job full time. Well, I can tell you this, that I know a number of consultants that are in these interim roles for years. And I just talked to him a couple of days ago. He just got off an assignment 4 years as the interim supply chain leader of a pretty sizable organization. So it was rather kind of comical. He said he finally got off that job. But that's what he did for a living and does for a living. And there are others out there that do the same thing. Now we asked, okay, how bad is this gap? Here's Jamie Kowalski making this big deal out of it. His survey is saying this, at least he's interpreting this information as being serious and maybe critical. But the people who filled out the survey themselves have said with a stronger answer that it is serious, it is critical. And as I said when we first started, it could be dire. We can't have people working in roles they don't belong in. Supply chain is too important. It's too complicated. It's too critical to the success clinically and financially to the hospital organizations. So there's a lot at stake here. And that's why I think the light bulb has gone on and they're going, yes, this is a serious problem we need to fix, and we need to fix it now. Now, that's a quick run through. I wasn't intending to read every bar or every pie chart. I tried to give you at least the message of what I thought that question and those answers might have represented. But I think the way you can wrap this up is you say, okay, there have been significant changes in the last 5 years since this last survey anyway. But some of the answers are still pretty close together. Some have gotten closer together, and some are still very much dislike. This serious or critical ranking of the gap has moved up considerably as well. The pandemic didn't help matters any with the unsatisfactory performance of the suppliers and the other supply chain partners. And also the question about whether or not the self-rating by the supply chain leaders saying, I thought we did a real good job, a big percentage of them. We continue to have this poor preparation for succession plans, 50%. The needle has barely moved in 5 years. That shouldn't be the case. I'd also suggest that the characteristics, the skill sets, the experience, the knowledge requirements, almost identical. And you know what? They've been almost the same for the 30 years I've been doing this kind of survey on healthcare providers, supply chain people, and their bosses. So it says to me that there's a lot of information here that is encouraging. There's some of it that's kind of scary. We have to get the scariness out of the stuff that's scary. We have to be prepared for whatever is coming next. And we know that we've got this train coming through this tunnel at a certain speed, and we better be prepared to deal with it, or else we're going to have all kinds of vacancies and no one to fill them. So there is a lot to do. Some of it is in your hands. Some of it you have to get other hands involved with, like your boss, and maybe even your boss's boss. I would urge you to do that. Use this as background information if you can. And if you want to find out more about it, first of all, let me stop there and say, I want to again thank the people who helped make this effort possible. They did a very nice job of helping us do this. And I want to thank you for taking your time out of your busy, busy, busy day to listen to this, hopefully thinking some of it was valuable and that you can utilize this information in your own situation, no matter if it's the one you're in today or the one you're going to at some point. If you have any questions about the survey itself or some of the answers or some of the, I'll say, uh, summations that I've made about the answers, you can contact the Bellwether League, and there's the website and the email address. So please do that. And thank you again for sharing your day with me. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Jamie, for coming attractions for supply chain leaders and how we may approach leadership needs now and in the future. Once again, I would like to introduce Karen Conway in our final panel to discuss clinical integration and a triad versus dyad approach, linking finance to clinicians and supply chain. Let's join as they explore the structures and governance needed to create a truly collaborative and evidence-based approach to providing reliable, optimal patient care.
Thank you, Deb. And thank you, everybody, to the final panel of the day. Once again, I am joined by quite a prestigious and a perfectly suited panel for the topic at hand. We're going to be talking about the clinically integrated supply chain and the potential to include both finance and suppliers as part of that expanding collaborative discussion between clinicians and between supply chain leaders. We're going to talk about what the clinically integrated supply chain is in just a minute. But first, let me introduce our panelists. Amanda Challa has more than 20 years of experience leading both supply chain and hospital operations across a variety of healthcare settings, from physician practices to community hospitals to academic medical centers. Today, she's the Chief Supply Chain Officer for Stanford Healthcare, Stanford Lucile Packard Health, and Stanford Valley Care. And she's responsible for over $1 billion in non-labor spend across that entire enterprise. Amanda is also a member of the board of ARM, which is the Supply Chain Association for the American Hospital Association. Dr. Jimmy Chung is a practicing general surgeon, and he's also the incoming chair of ARM. Jimmy currently serves as the Associate Vice President of Perioperative Portfolio for Providence St. Joseph Health. And in that role, he works with both physicians and operational stakeholders across a 51 hospital system. There, he helps develop and integrate perioperative strategies, oversees clinical value analysis of perioperative devices, and integrates physician leadership into system-wide supply chain standardization initiatives. Todd Nelson is the Chief Partnership Executive for the Healthcare Financial Management Association, which is really the preeminent trade association for healthcare finance executives, with over 70,000 members. Todd develops and oversees HFMA's partnership strategy with academic institutions, associations, and with industry partners. And in this role, he collaborates both with HFMA members, but also with other key stakeholders, including ARM, by the way, across all sectors of the industry. And before joining HFMA, Todd served 15 years as a hospital CFO. Last but not least is Scott Wilson. And Scott is a 25-year veteran of Medtronic. Over the years he's worked for Medtronic, he's held a variety of leadership roles in finance, sales operations, spinal, field, and loaner inventory management, including human tissue and distribution. Currently, he is the program director for America's Supply Chain for Medtronic. And there he collaborates with IDN supply chain leaders, trying to find more efficient, more cost-effective ways to ensure that product is where it's needed to help patients. He's also very focused on Medtronic's supply chain resiliency and responsible sourcing efforts, which is a topic that we'll also get into a little bit later in the panel. But I'm going to start with you, Jimmy, because we had the pleasure of serving on the ARM board together in your first stint, and I think it was my second stint on the ARM board. And you chaired our very first clinically integrated supply chain task force, during which you helped come up with the definition for clinically integrated supply chain that ARM uses, and you can see that on the slide here. But what I'd really like is, in your own words, really, what is it? What's it look like? And I think probably most importantly, why should we all care?
Well, thank you, Karen, and thanks for the opportunity to let me talk about one of my favorite topics. The clinical integrated supply chain really came about initially while I was on the board to think of ways that we can integrate the physicians and clinicians who are involved in surgeries and product decision-making processes like value analysis to really pay attention to how we can improve the value of healthcare that we provide to our patients. Initially, as a rare physician member of ARM, I was very much interested in providing education for the physicians in physician organizations about what ARM was doing. And then eventually we created a task force to talk about how we can educate the supply chain professionals about clinical outcomes. And after a lot of thought and discussion and collaboration, we really came upon this new idea that would be sort of the next phase of CQO, which is the CQO movement that ARM had developed probably about 10 years ago. So as CQO is a concept in the direction that healthcare should go towards, we really needed a model by which we can achieve CQO, and the clinical integrated supply chain really came up to that point. And what this really means is from the supply chain side, the supply chain professionals should be a part of and collaborate with clinicians in terms of what is best for our patients, not thinking just about what is the cheapest way to procure a product or what is the least expensive product or what's the best contract, but really thinking about what leads to the best patient outcomes. And conversely, from a physician standpoint, it's all about not choosing whatever you want to use or having the freedom to choose whatever you think is best based on your relationships with vendors or your personal experience, but using evidence-based practice and thinking about how we can reduce the cost of medicine by working together with supply chain professionals. And so as we drive really towards that combination of clinically integrated supply chain as a collaborative effort between supply chain and clinicians, we realize that it really needs to include a number of different other stakeholders, such as suppliers and hospital administrators and other healthcare industry providers as well. And especially with payment models now moving towards a more value-based payment model, we really have to focus on how do we provide the best care for our patients with the highest value by reducing costs and reducing unnecessary waste. And that is what the clinically integrated supply chain is really all about.
Thank you. Excellent explanation. And just very quickly, if anybody hasn't heard of CQO movement, that stands for Cost, Quality, Outcomes movement, and really looking at and getting supply chain's role in terms of looking at the total cost of care and the role of supply chain in that, the total quality of care. And then finally, it's really about the financial outcomes that are driven by exceptional patient outcomes. And we're going to talk a little bit more. I'm glad you brought up about multiple stakeholders. We couldn't have all of them on the panel today, but we've got a couple of key ones, and we'll get to finance and suppliers in a minute. But I want to turn to you, Amanda, because I know this has really been a focus for you and your work with Dr. Kevin Shea at Stanford. You've also, as I mentioned in your bio, have worked in a variety of roles, executive, operational, supply chain. You've worked in physician practices in community hospitals and academic medical centers. I'm curious, based on that, if you think clinical supply chain integration works better in certain settings, or maybe the question is better, really, what are the prerequisites? You know, what do you need to have in place to get started on this journey?
Thank you, Karen. Excellent question. You know, to me, clinical integration, clinical collaboration can occur across any setting, regardless of the type or size of an organization. It's fundamentally based on the concept of collaboration and partnership. It's about how we partner with purpose and intention with the healing hands and the clinical teams who directly impact and influence patient care. Um, I would say there is probably different levels of maturity that can vary from something that's very transactional and tactical in nature, such as a basic value analysis structure, to something much more advanced, as has been mentioned with the CQO movement. Having a value analysis does not necessarily equate to clinically integrated. And clinically integrated is not just about having paid medical positions or dyadic partners. It's a much broader partnership built into what I would say is the operating and strategic framework of how we operate the supply chain. And it's the broader viewpoint, as Jimmy mentioned, of clinicians, finance, and I would also throw in data intelligence that provides us information that we can come together and take action on. So I'll give an example here. So at Sanford, it's how we took even our operating leaders across supply chain, and we've structured them to have formal assignments with clinical leaders. It's how we've set up those collaborations. You take that a step further, and you think about clinical integration in your supply chain, and it's how we've taken our frontline tier 1 positions as inventory coordinators and partnered them with nursing and surgical services leads. Clinical integration is really about how we partner across those constituents much more broadly. And so whether it's something from selection to utilization management, to waste reductions, to recalls, to the evaluation of clinically acceptable equivalents to practice, it's really a spectrum. And so I would say some organizations may have a more mature framework that gives them insights and understanding on the total cost of care, to scorecards, to having risk-based, value-based contracting. But fundamentally, it is based on this concept of collaboration and partnership. And so really, as we think about a clinically integrated supply chain, the supply chain role is really about facilitating, empowering, supporting, informing, and guiding.
Excellent. And, you know, I really like your emphasis too on having a framework. And I think also, what are you trying to accomplish? So it's going to involve different people. It's going to look a little bit differently, but I think you have that framework, you have that governance. So you have some kind of consistency on that. And speaking of collaboration, I also failed to remind folks, but hopefully, since this is the last panel of the day, we want you to engage in the discussion. So feel free to use the chat to be able to offer your comments or ask questions, etc. If you want to ask questions of the panelists who will be answering in real time, please use the Q&A and use the chat for integration. So now we're going to switch over to finance. And Todd, I'm going to call on you to be every CFO for us, or generally speaking, et cetera. We talked about in the abstract this increasing involvement of finance executives, but not in the role that supply chain has come to know, not necessarily love, which is expense management, and more in this journey we're all on that Jimmy mentioned before, moving to value-based healthcare. So is this something that's even on the radar of CFOs? And if so, what role do you believe they can and should be playing?
Thanks, Karen. Appreciate being invited to be part of this panel with these experts and answer that question and others. So when we think about the CFO and the notion of value, HFMA over a decade ago started something called the Value Project. And the definition of the value in the Value Project was very similar to what Jimmy and Amanda have already spoken about. The total cost of care over patient outcome. And so you think about that in different ways that you can increase value. It's not just about lowering the cost. Sometimes it's about improving the outcome to increase value. And so you take that forward for the CFO and think about value-based contracting, where it's more than just price. It's quality measures, it's satisfaction measures, it's all of those things. It is definitely on the CFO radar. It's a little scary from a CFO perspective because you're talking about accepting risk. Every accountant, finance person I know is risk adverse. I mean, we were taught to be conservative. I mean, that's the training that we all grew up with. So all these great new ideas kind of push us out of the comfort zone. But that doesn't mean that we're not thinking about them and that we don't embrace them. It just may take us a little bit longer than other folks. And I would agree with Amanda's comments certainly around collaboration. So when we think about value, the finance folks can help provide the data, create the systems and some of the structure, provide the analysis behind that, but also need to provide the collaborative spirit along with other folks at the table. And I think part of that is having the seat at the table together as a team, not just operating over, off to the side and then not participating in the discussions. I don't know any CFO or finance person that's going to tell a clinician what product to use from a quality perspective or how to use it. We just want to be part of the discussion to understand it, provide analysis and information, and from there, it's a clinical decision about patient outcomes. So I think being part of the discussion is the key.
Excellent. So we'll expand the discussion and we'll move over to our resident supplier. Not sure I can call you every supplier, but Scott, we really appreciate you joining. And I want to show you a couple of slides that were shared with me by Bill Sellis. He runs supply chain at Spectrum in Michigan, and he absolutely sees suppliers also at the table. But oftentimes, we do have this discussion fairly insular to the hospital or the healthcare system. And as we all know, certainly the pandemic showed us with supply chain that there's interdependencies and there's a whole lot going on upstream that's absolutely critical. So he sees suppliers as critical to this. I know you're primarily a supply chain guy at the table, but I also know Medtronic has this very strong focus on value-based healthcare. So Scott, I'm wondering, how can manufacturers show up and what can they offer to this effort?
Well, yeah, listening to this conversation is interesting because I am not from the commercial side. I am supply chain, but in the last 5 years, I've gotten to sit in on negotiations and see a lot. So it's really gives me kind of an interesting perspective, especially when you think about this, because we've got different types of vendors that are customers that I walk into. You see transactional and you see collaborative. Whenever you start moving away from price and you get into the collaborative, then it really does change the conversation a lot. The transactional is like, don't bring that in here. We don't want to discuss that. We don't want to rock the boat. And when you talk about Bill Sellis, I actually work with Bill a lot because he is very collaborative. But it allows for an open conversation to find solutions. Is kind of my biggest thing that I see. But when I think about how do you bring in the supplier, again, one, it's that collaborative piece. I've spent the last year and a half with the COVID season trying to figure out, okay, where should I be? What should we be offering? What should we be doing? Resiliency came to center stage. We spent a lot of time working on data sharing, but more importantly, just trying to figure out how do you do that well to actually change resiliency and ensure resiliency, because we both are in the same game. We both have the patient is the end game. And so I think companies or providers need good strategic partners. The one thing we've heard a lot about is we want to move to more strategic relationships. We want to reduce vendors. And the way I see that, you need good partners. You need that business continuity or a partner with a strong business continuity program so that they can ensure supply. You also need partners that have programs that you need. Social responsibility is a very important topic right now. That's a large C-suite discussion. We're seeing it come down from boards. We have a pretty mature program of that, and we're not the only one. A lot of our competitors do as well. But these are the type of things you want to expect out of a good partner. Another piece is we've been around the block. We do see about 3,000 hospitals a year doing things in different ways. In that collaborative agreement, we've got solution groups we can bring in, as other companies do as well. But we've seen we did a study this year with one Midwest group, and they actually paid for the consulting and got about a $700,000 return. And again, that's not an advertisement for Medtronic, but it's just that I think that opens it up. And when I listen to the conversation today and I listen to the value analysis piece and all, I guess one of the questions I would love to ask the other panelists is, are those things all decided by the time you get to the negotiation, or is there a way to bring us in and maybe some value analysis people in so that we can kind of have a back and forth? Or is it kind of, how do we best do that?
So maybe I'll turn that question then to actually to Amanda and to Jimmy and to Todd. Maybe Scott's direct question. And then I think Scott, there's a whole bunch of stuff to unpack in Scott's comments about the importance of resiliency, of sustainability. We've had contracting come up a couple of times. I'd like to talk about some outcomes-based contracting and risk-based contracting, but let's go to Scott's specific question and maybe some perspectives. Jimmy, I'll start with you in terms of what manufacturers, is there something they could be bringing sooner to the discussion, or different kinds of information, et cetera? Then we'll go to Amanda and then Todd.
Right. Well, that's a really good question, and maybe a question that we even internally will struggle with from various points of the value analysis process, and also the different types of value analysis that we do. So a lot of times we'll be doing value analysis to review a category of products. A lot of times we'll be doing value analysis on a new product request. And sometimes we'll be doing value analysis for a procedure, not necessarily a single product. And so in those different scenarios, and there's many others, but at least in those kind of broad categories of scenarios, the vendor can play, or the supplier can play different roles. So for example, one of the things that most hospital organizations do not want the vendors to be involved in are discussions where the decision makers, the clinicians who are making the decisions, don't want to have bias or any conflict of interest being introduced into the discussion. In those cases, we generally don't invite the vendor to that discussion until the decision's been made. In other categories, we actually do depend on the vendors to bring some data. So for example, if it's a new product with new research and we don't really have a lot of data to go by, while we understand that it's supplier sponsored studies that have provided some of that data, we do want to see, how far along has it been going in the research? What kind of patient outcomes are we looking at, so that maybe we can partner with them to further that research and continue that evaluation and see what kind of collaboration that we could have. And and also when we are doing maybe broad category RFPs or such, it's actually very helpful to have the vendors be available to discuss the details of the negotiations, to be willing to listen to our physicians when we have specific clinical needs or clinical requests. We've had numerous examples of that here at Providence, where we've invited the physicians and the value analysis teams to openly discuss what our concerns are with the individual suppliers and vendors. And so I think there are absolutely critical moments where we want to partner with them, but also be able to make sure that they respect the idea that conflict of interest would be a big issue in some of these discussions. Now that said, when we think about the clinically integrated supply chain and looking at patient outcomes, that level of discussion has to mature to the point where we are all going to benefit from having a good patient experience, which includes outcomes and avoiding complications and such. And in those situations, the supplier absolutely has to be a key player in understanding how can their products prevent complications, or how do they cause complications, and what kind of risk do they share with the provider. Because in the end, if their product does not perform well or causes quality issues, then it's going to be bad for business for them. So it's really mutually beneficial, especially if we start going into bundle payment programs, that they are a critical part of that teamwork.
So I'm going to turn it to you, Amanda, but I want to pull on one thread that Jimmy raised, and you can pull on it with me, or you can ignore it if you want. But that is this concept. So, Jimmy, you mentioned, for example, maybe we need to collaborate further with the manufacturer to get additional evidence because something is brand new in the market. And we know with medical devices, I often say it's not like with pharmaceuticals. You can't give somebody the placebo implantable device. We have to build this off of real world evidence. And certainly in places like Europe, just to keep your product on the market, manufacturers have to gather real world evidence on product performance. And this isn't just about understanding when there's adverse events, but starting to understand that this product works best on these, this patient cohort, et cetera. Or there's just issues in terms of, the acceleration of a new device. If you've got that real world evidence, you can get that, a manufacturer could get that device approved and something could be available for patient care that could be life-changing or life-saving. So, I'm wondering if you've got any thoughts in terms of how hospitals might need to collaborate more, or in this kind of environment. Is there a pathway for that? As I said, you could do that, or you can respond to Scott's question as well.
No, both excellent questions and excellent points. I do think it varies in terms of the pathway and the level of response and engagement, going back to kind of the maturity of your own supply chain organization. And I'll introduce essentially a new thread, which is, data. How well do you understand your own supply chain at the utilization level in terms of what products you're utilizing, the volumes, the variation? Because I think that's a key component to the collaboration of bringing the suppliers in. And I think one way in which suppliers can assist on the clinically integrated supply chain is when organizations don't have that complete understanding, maybe at the patient level, is even understanding the book of business. And understanding it in the perspective of, this is what you're buying. This is the frequency of what you're buying. This is the variation that we're seeing. Especially for, I would say, more complex systems, larger systems in which there's multiple entities or organizations within a bigger corporation where there may be further variation. That is how I would respond to that. And I think there's another theme in the essence of when we're talking about strategic contracting and so forth, is the recognition that not all contracts, in fact, few may be strategic in nature in which they're outcomes based. And I say that because when we're looking at buying a product or a service, it's understanding what does that product or service do for us? What is being measured? How relevant is it in the value proposition? And then being able to quantify what aspects are subjective or objective. And I think that's really important in the measurement. And that's why I said probably a small percent of our contracts will be performance-based, will be around that value-based outcomes. And some may be just, commodity-based, maybe strategic relationships in another way. So I think it's really important understanding what you're contracting for, the bigger relationship with the supplier, the relationship with the clinicians, the number variation, and bringing all of that together, if that makes sense.
Excellent, thank you. I want to show a slide real quick before we go to Todd, because Todd, you referenced risk-based contracts early on. And I think you were probably talking about risk-based contracts with payers, which takes a lot of the CFO's time and energy and thought power. But we're also talking about outcomes-based contracting that a hospital might do, or a health system with a manufacturer. And this slide is a very simplistic representation of a very complex topic. And that's that idea of, you've got, let's say you've got evidence as a manufacturer that your product, when used on the right patient population, can achieve a certain metric. Let's just say, reducing some hospital-acquired condition. And, and if you make that, then then the hospital pays a premium above that base price. If the evidence does not show in real world that this is happening, then it's a lower price for that particular product. As I said, a very, very simplistic concept. I'm wondering if you might offer some opinions, Todd. Well, I want to show one more slide, and that's some research that we did recently with HFMA that really showed CFOs seeing a growth in this outcomes-based contracting with manufacturers from about 8% now to about 35% in 5 years. How does outcomes-based contracting kind of fit with risk-based contracting with payers? Is there a way we can create a three-legged stool here? Is there a way that we can pull all the players together and perhaps, if we are able to lower costs, improve quality as a result of these kinds of contractual agreements and data sharing and relationships, do they fit together? Are they really feasible? I know we could write a treatise on this, so in 30 seconds or less.
In 30 seconds or less.
We'll give it a little more than that.
Yeah, could they potentially fit together? Yes. I think we're talking aspirational. It doesn't mean that it's 100 years from now, but it means that, if we think about where we started in this conversation was a clinically integrated supply chain, which is really about getting the folks inside the health system working together. Then we moved into talking about, or at least I talked about, value-based care models, and that, you're right, is involving the health plans, the payers. So then it's moving a little further on the outside. And then we talked about involving the supplier community, manufacturers, distributors in that, which is also outside. And now we're talking about trying to involve everybody. And, do I think there's a potential that we can do that? Do I also think that's the right thing to get to, with the patient in the center of that, the focus on the patient and the outcome? Absolutely. But I think it's still aspirational. One of the things I think to Scott's question was around, do we come to the table? When we do come to the table, are all the boxes already checked? Have we already made the decision? Do we already know what we want? Are we, he didn't say this, so I won't put words in his mouth. Are those finance people inflexible? Do they just want the certain thing and they're not willing to collaborate? Well, I would say that we certainly have discussions about, what are the outcomes that we want from the meeting, the collaboration. But how we get there, there's multiple avenues to get there. So I think that it is possible for outcomes-based contracting to get us to some of those outcomes. That's different than just, the price I want is X, and that's really all I care about. I mean, that's a component, certainly, but outcome, availability, if the pandemic taught us anything, it was about how can we be agile and resilient. I mean, and those are things we'd all talked about before, but it's really placed a special emphasis on that recently. So that was 37 seconds. I couldn't do it under
that was
30.
Perfect. So one thing is you actually brought it back to Scott's question. So on behalf of Scott, I thank you for that, because I can make things rather convoluted. But the question is, you can't invite everybody to the party right at the first, right at the beginning. You got to find the right party to go to, and kind of what is that mix. But at least we're starting to have the conversation. And so you mentioned something else, Todd. The other reason I am so thrilled you're on the panel is you brought it back to another line of question that I think, in light of the pandemic, we can't let go. And that is resiliency. We certainly saw, I actually believe that clinical supply chain integration was accelerated because clinicians and supply chain had to work together. And of course, they had to work with finance because we had to find the product. We had to find clinically acceptable products if we couldn't find the original one, and we had to pay for it. So, and then suppliers are certainly critical into this. So I guess my question, and I'll open this up to, I'm going to start with Amanda, because Amanda, your organization has been, was recognized by Gartner for your work around resiliency. And I guess the question is, does issues around the availability, the ability to supply, the risks upstream in a supply chain, are they going to start factoring in and be a part of this? We always have focused on price. We're focusing, on performance of products. But what about the resiliency factor, the risk mitigation? Is that going to be a more important part of this clinical, supply chain, finance, supplier discussion?
So Karen, I'm smiling here because I think the word resiliency or resilient supply chain has probably been used maybe a few dozen times already in this call alone. And so I would say it's probably one of the most overused terms from the pandemic, which alone represents the factor of importance in all seriousness. And I think it's really about how we interpret the word resiliency and define the elements of reliability that either need to be a part of our contract or a part of our sourcing strategy decisions. And so when we're thinking about that, how do we demonstrate when we're working, for example, with suppliers, the degree in which we understand the upstream supply chain in a reliable manner? And so when I think about that and I'm working with suppliers and partners, is do you have the visibility in your supply chain? Have you built in some level of redundancy and capacity? And can you communicate and timely, effectively with me as I manage my supply chain with my clinicians, with my clinical partner? And if I'm able to provide you some level of data on demand planning and inventory, or demand planning, can you provide me the data of inventory? So I think the whole concept of resiliency, it's not stagnant. It's not a one and done, let me write my emergency plan and put it into the books. It's really around the concept of agility and how we manage that with our suppliers, our clinicians, and our operators. I mean, there's so many different parties that come to the table when we're talking about resiliency. It's not going away. And what I might introduce is kind of this concept of what's really the procurement definition. And to me, that procurement definition has adjusted to not only the performance of a product or service, but we're adding in reliability. So it's performance plus reliability divided by kind of cost, because the cost piece of the equation isn't going to go away. And now with the pandemic, we've introduced times diversity and times sustainability, if that makes sense. And so that's how I would redefine kind of procurement and this concept of resiliency being one of the elements of this bigger equation.
So Scott, this really gets into your sweet spot in terms of, you've heard Amanda talk a lot about challenges and opportunities around resiliency, sustainability, very, very broad. There's, depending on what we're trying to accomplish, depending on the supply chain for a product, et cetera. But after you've heard Amanda talk, and based on your conversations with IDNs across the country as well, what can manufacturers be doing that perhaps hospitals and healthcare systems aren't aware of? And do you see this as a competitive advantage for a manufacturer who can address these kinds of concerns well?
I think that's an excellent question about the competitive advantage. I think that remains to be seen, and I'd love to hear the opinion of the others after I get through. But I've spent the last year and a half working on this. We started getting these huge data requests for where are your manufacturing? Can we have the phone number of the plant manager, and et cetera and so forth. And we kind of started there. Everybody kind of said, okay, we couldn't get PPE. Let's make sure we know everything. And like a lot of other manufacturers, I have over 70,000 active SKUs. And so if you ask me for that information, number one, how could I give it to you? And think about data standards, et cetera, just the mobilization of getting that data moved. But, we've spent a lot of time thinking about, okay, what do you need to know and what makes sense in data sharing to actually increase resiliency? And if I give you all that, how does it become digestible? How do you know what you need to know when you need to know? And that's what we've seen kind of as the issue. We had led a workshop in the spring. Medtronic did, with about 12 IDNs, and just kind of discussed how in the heck do we share this? How do we do it efficiently? But after listening to Amanda, there is the big question. We need to define what is important information. Providers, just like us, our supply chain looks just like yours. We use event watch coordinators to watch for things happening. We have to figure out what are our important products. We have to figure out where we've got multiple sources, where we've got single, what we need to protect, what we don't need to protect. And so I think there's still more definition to come. But we've kind of approached this with, what do you need to know? You need to be able to trust us. You need to know that a supplier not only has a business continuity program, but they actually execute on it. A lot of people have a book, and we learned a lot in Maria. We've got certified leadership running that group now. We've got plans in place. We use event watch coordinators. We've got a monitoring group of Medtronic people that monitor what's going on. And we really have a good, robust program. During that workshop, I had our business continuity leader share what we do kind of in detail. And everybody came back and said, that's the first or second time we've ever seen that. So for me, I'm trying to share what we do, how we do it, get feedback, and then also Just figure out how we continue the conversation of how we use appropriate data to meet both of our needs. I can flood you with data, but at the end of the day, when I have a shortage, the other thing we try to work through is we use NDAs and so that we can actually communicate with that supply chain leader from the hospital and tell them what's going on. If we have a shortage, you ask, we say, this is going to be a 2-week problem. This is going to be a long problem, or we've said this is a problem we can't solve right now. Use these people's substitute. But I think the thing that we want to provide is we want you to know that we're good at this, or that we're making a great effort at it. Nobody's perfect. In the event we're not perfect, like what we saw with ventilators, we will act to try to do what we can. We open source the design specs and brought others in and try to shoot in all directions we could on that. But like I say, I think you want somebody with a great effort, someone who will respond and work with you, and someone who will try to tell you what's going on when it happens. Now, do we achieve that 100% of the time? No, but I think we've found a pathway to work with that. And I guess my question here is, kind of like what you asked to begin with, is that a competitive advantage? I would hope it's going to be, because we hope it is. It's the way we'd like to be treated and the way we want to treat others.
So Todd, you've heard, thank you, Scott, and you've heard from your colleagues or respective stakeholders within the hospital healthcare delivery environment, and also from Scott. I'm going to ask the real direct question, kind of the elephant in the room question people have asked me. It's like, given the financial hardships that hospitals have absolutely faced, given the pandemic, will CFOs really prioritize some of these other things over price, at least in the short term? And if so, is this the kind of data that that Scott is talking about that will help? Is there different kind of data that you want from a supplier, or that you want from your supply chain executive or your physician executive?
Yeah, I mean, I think price is always going to be important to the finance folks. In fact, to everybody, no matter what part of this collaborative partnership you are, price is important from all angles. That being said, we're thinking about price in more than just the per unit price. It's a value analysis, and it's an analysis that includes everything from patient outcome to the ability to get it when you need it, to having a discussion around the organization that has the plan on the shelf and the organization that knows how to act on the plan. I think about it like an evaluation from a rating agency. When they look at a health system to determine a bond rating, they look at, do they have a plan, and how is their financial performance? But maybe more importantly, they look at, when you hit adversity, like everyone did, how do you act on that plan? And so if you may have the best plan in the world and the best financials in the world, but no one escaped the pandemic. So what's the leadership team's ability to act on that plan? And I think it is a competitive advantage for those that have created a plan and know how to act on it. I think visibility and sharing of data is important. I think a dialogue and a discussion is important. And, I think to some extent it's deciding with a group of stakeholders, what are the important factors, back to kind of the equation that Amanda put out there, and looking at various stakeholders and saying, how many of these, where are they? Where do they fall within that equation? And, do you create a scorecard that ranks organizations? And I don't mean like for an award, but when we sit down with a health plan, we talk about the certain things that are important to us from a health system with that health plan. And if those are quality measures, if that's claim payment, if that's price, whatever it is, that's part of the scorecard. And I think the same thing here when you think about the supplier community, a scorecard per se, that allows for a dialogue and a sharing of information so everybody's really on the same level playing field and understanding what are the expectations that have been developed mutually through a discussion, not just Todd's Finance 101 expectations, but that mutual discussion with everybody at the table.
I'm going to introduce one other topic as we're getting close to the end of our panel, also related to the pandemic. And that was really, the pandemic really laid bare this challenge of disparities in health. The fact that poor people, generally, more people of color than those in the white population, had higher acuity, more hospitalizations, more death as a result of COVID. A variety of factors, but a major one is these underlying comorbidities that tend to exist in those populations compared to a white population: hypertension, obesity, diabetes, et cetera. I know this is a topic in among the boards of trustees and in the C-suites increasingly. And supply chain plays in this space when we start thinking about diversity and diverse suppliers. I'd love to get Amanda a few thoughts from you, and then Jimmy, related to where this is showing up, in the space, in your area of control, and how important will we be including these kinds of things, diversity in contracts going forward, in sourcing decisions increasingly. And then maybe we can jump over to Scott really quickly and get a little bit some more thoughts on what a manufacturer can do there.
Excellent question, Karen. I think the reality is with the pandemic, we experienced this uptick of innovations. I think the fragility of the global supply chain became very, very well known. And so in one sense, we're forever changed, whether it's our personal or professional experiences. And so it's up to us from a leadership standpoint to take this opportunity and change. We're essentially creating the future. We're not going to go back to this normal. It's about how we define the future normal. And we can't ignore, put a blind eye to the data and to the world and the facts and the stories around us. And so going back to the question about what is changing, what has changed, I'll say even in the state of California, things have changed. California OSHPD now is requiring supplier diversity mandate reporting. That was never the case before. And I think the whole concept of inclusion, diversity, health equity combined with sustainability is probably a renewed and sharpened focus. I think it's always been there, but not anywhere near the level of priority. And when we're thinking about healthcare as a business, it's a people business at heart. And so as we think about that, part of our social contract and being in healthcare in the healing and community type of missions that we have is the impact that we have on the environmental footprint. So I think it's not just a focus for the supply chain, it's a focus for healthcare in general. I can say for our organization, inclusion, diversity, sustainability are all major initiatives, even for the university, for our partners and so forth. And so when we now break it down to supply chain's role and what supply chain does, it's how we source, how we contract. And so I think it goes back to this kind of adjustment of this equation that I introduced of procurement, where it's performance, reliability on top, it's performance plus that reliability, that agility, that resiliency over cost, but now we're including factors of diversity and sustainability. And with that, it's how are we changing and how have we changed our RFP languages? How are we doing a value analysis where those are factors that we consider in this overall decision-making matrix?
None of this is easy and gets increasingly complicated, but I think it speaks to the importance of supply chain as a facilitator. Jimmy, you've been hearing us discuss resiliency, diversity, sustainability, et cetera. We've just got a few minutes left, and I do want to jump to Scott before we end. Are these on the minds of practicing physicians, or do they see this more as, oh, that's that's for my public health colleagues, et cetera? I know you and I have discussed in terms of sustainability. The UK, for example, is trying to reduce its carbon footprint of its supply chain by reducing unnecessary care. Because if you don't use that drug or that device that wasn't needed, then you've reduced the carbon footprint, as long as you've not hurt the healthcare. Are you having these kinds of conversations with your peers, or should you be?
Well, Karen, leave it to you to ask such a multifaceted question that we could
just to confuse.
We could have an all-day session on that question alone, as you know. But the answer is yes, with a lot of education from the clinician and non-clinician leadership together. So as an example, that Providence had already declared that by 2030 we would become a carbon negative organization. And so a huge part of that has to do really with the socially responsible sourcing, addressing all of the social inequities, as well as access to care, but focusing specifically on supply chain, we're really trying to very deliberately and intentionally making that an issue for our physicians. So for example, within our value analysis process, we're just starting to develop a scoring system to look at what is the environmental impact of not just the product, how it's manufactured, how it's packaged, how it's delivered, where the raw materials are sourced, what kind of labor practices does the manufacturer have, but also bringing into light what are some of the environmental impacts of the clinical outcomes of this product. So for example, if a product reduces surgical site infections by a certain percent, what's the environmental value of that product, not just from cost perspective, but also from the fact that when you have a patient in the hospital with an infection or a complication, you're using that much more product that creates a additional carbon footprint. We had one initiative a couple of years ago where we wanted to reduce the greenhouse gas effect of anesthesia gases. So we educated our physicians in terms of which of the three major gases have the greatest greenhouse gas effect, and which one were the cheapest, and none of them really have a significant clinical outcomes difference other than maybe some practice differences. And I would say that to address your question, many of the physicians actually really didn't care if, to hear about the clinical differences or the lack of clinical evidence. But when we talked about environmental impact and what kind of environmental impact the individual physician was creating by using that particular product, they paid attention. So it really spoke to us, and it spoke to the physicians that they do care about the environment. And when you bring that data to them, they will change practice based on just knowing what their carbon impact is on the environment. So they do care.
Tremendous example. So we are at time. But Scott, want to give you 30 seconds to be able to just offer any final things that people should be thinking about. And then we'll wrap up the panel.
For us, like I say, we've got a pretty robust responsible sourcing group. And we would love to be able to share these things, but we'd like to share them kind of outside of the negotiation so that you can hear them and understand what they are. And I think that's one of the challenges I'm trying to figure out is how do I get that message across, not just to sell Medtronic, but just to be heard. So thank you for the time today. I appreciate it. And I learned way more than I gave. So thank you.
Well, as I've always said, it's, all of this really starts with a conversation. So I want to thank my panelists for an excellent conversation and follow through some of my convoluted questions on this. It is an exploration, and hopefully we can all get back together and have that conversation again in a forum like this, and certainly in the meantime, in our daily interactions. I also want to thank the attendees for your participation as well. I'd like to now introduce our co-founder and the executive director of the Bellwether League Foundation. Many of you already know Rick Dana Barlow as the senior editor of Healthcare Purchasing News. He has been a fixture in healthcare media for many, many years. Rick, please help us take the educational forum home.
Thank you, Karen. Allow me also to thank each of our esteemed faculty members who shared insights, as well as platinum sustaining sponsor GHX for generously sponsoring and supporting this event for all of you to access freely. And finally, thank all of you for joining us this afternoon for our 8th Healthcare Supply Chain Leadership Forum. I hope that each of you was able to glean something beneficial and useful from this experience that you can apply to your career, share with your colleagues, and implement at your organization. Please visit Bellwether League's website for even more content, including Leaders and Luminaries magazine, podcasts, profiles, and lots of videos. We also invite you to attend and sponsor the 14th annual Bellwether League Foundation Induction and Recognition event. It's scheduled for Monday evening, October 4th. You will find more details on the website as they become available. Let me leave you with some final thoughts about the healthcare supply chain, which I consider the engine of a healthcare organization. When it comes to the C-suite, supply chain tends to be an outsider, but it should strive to generate insider appeal. We've explored the need for supply chain to be part of the C-suite, but maybe we need to concentrate on something more important. Regardless of a supply chain leader sitting at the executive table, at the very least, the C-suite should recognize the inherent value of and need for Hall of Fame level supply chain performance. Within the last year alone, we've lost 6 prominent and preeminent bellwethers with names you most likely recognize: Brother Ned Gerber, Paul Powell, Tom Hughes, Henry Burling, Ed Harden, and Jim Dicko. All 6 represented great hearts and great minds in healthcare supply chain. We must remember that supply chain needs great minds and great hearts like theirs, and we salute them for their contributions. Whatever you want to call it, supply chain, supply channel, supply network, please remember this: respect the chain, respect the channel, respect the network, but above all else, respect the people. Look out for one another. Remember the daily challenges supply chain professionals face and the demands they experience that pave the way for high quality patient care before, during, and after a crisis like the pandemic from which we're starting to emerge right now. Until next time, I'm Rick Barlow with Bellwether League Foundation. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and evening.